So you stayed in Mexico City
No.
after that, or
No, I married, and my husband was in the State Department.
Oh, okay.
So we went to live in Mérida
Mhm.
for 2.5 years. Then we went to D.C. for a few months, then to Buenos Aires for 4 years,
Oh wow, didn't
and
know
then
that.
to Pittsburgh, where he went back to school, my
Mhm.
husband. Then we came to Tucson,
Mhm. This is Barclay.
Parkway.
Okay. Mhm. So you're back in Tucson in 1969, and how did you end up here,
Well,
or back here, I should
yeah,
say?
my husband Barkley went back to school to get a degree in drama, a master's, and he went to Carnegie Mellon, which at that time was still a very good drama school, in directing. And so we lived there for 2 years, and so that was my first experience with the civil rights movement in this country, because we got there in '67, and '68 is when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And I got a job with a poverty program there in Pittsburgh. It was kind of funny because it was a poverty program run by the Catholic Church to work in the different African American ghettos in the Pittsburgh area. And I did, I arrived there, was looking for a job. My husband was going to graduate school. We had 2 very little boys. And I knew nothing about racial politics in this country. I mean, I had been gone during the whole time.
Right, and at a crucial moment.
At a crucial moment. And so, I mean, I was all in favor of it, but I really didn't know about it. And so I applied for this job that was some kind of job with this poverty program in Hazelwood, which was a mixed ghetto, but mostly African American, right on the Monongahela River, right outside the Laughlin Jones steel mill. And so I went, and he wouldn't interview me. I was having trouble. Nobody knew what my degree was. I mean, it was all crazy. And so he finally interviewed me, and I got a call the next day that I was hired. So he took me over to the office over in this ghetto area, and everybody would walk by and look at me. There was a glass partition to my office, and they'd all come by, and so one said I was Filipino, another one said I was Japanese, etc. Well, he was supposed to have hired an African American, right? But he had problems with the ones he had hired, these strong men who really wanted to change. And so he turned and hired me. I was a safe little Catholic girl, kind of, he could manage. So he hired me. I later put 2 and 2 together. It took me a while to realize why he had hired me. But by then I had the job, right? So it was a horrible, horrible learning experience. I worked out of this convent, and the thing was to have programs for tutoring for children after school, had a senior citizens program. There were a lot of older people living on these steep hills that came down into the canyon, and they'd walk up 100 steps to go to their house, and here we have ice and snow. They'd fall and get hurt. There wasn't an ambulance there, and so the first thing we did was raise money for an ambulance. But what I learned very quickly as I started going house to meet people and tell them about the program was that the Polish people, the Irish people, they were all workers who had been laid off from the steel mill mostly. And so they were in dire poverty. It would have nothing to do with any poverty program. Nothing to do with a health clinic, nothing to do with the education. I mean, it was just there for blacks. And we are not, it was really harsh. The school, which was down this main avenue, the high school, looked like a prison. It had these huge metal fences around it with police. There were horrible fights there every day. So I had this tutoring program, the one I was the closest to, and I'd get all these African American kids come in for tutoring. And we'd give all kinds of food and cake, and, all kinds of things to attract them to come. But nobody would have any, I couldn't get a single white kid in. I couldn't get a white person to come to the senior program that we had, nothing. So one day we decided to have a talent show. God. So the nun that worked with me, she was great. She was as crazy as I was. So we put out this big ad, talent show on X night, come in and we're going to have a prize and that kind of thing. So we had calls from all over Pittsburgh, all these kids with their bands and they all had dance and, all kinds of stuff, all African American. So we were really happy, this is going to be a good thing. We worked it out with the priest. He said, just be sure you're careful. We said, yeah, we'll be careful. The nun and I are there. So the night comes. And I'm sitting in my little tiny office. We had the auditorium down the hall. And this big burly policeman comes running in and he said, who's in charge here? And I go, oh, can I help you? What on earth are you doing? We've got all kinds of riots are going to start here and it's all your fault. I said, we're just having a talent show. What do you mean a riot? You can't call all these people together and expect there won't be a bunch of trouble. He had 20 police cars outside. Oh my gosh. Now this is a canyon. There's only like 2 roads to get out of it, right? So once you come in, you're trapped down there. And the church was kind of up on the hill of the convent. And so you had cars parked over. And so people couldn't get in because all these police cars were there. So some young kid, broke a glass window of one of these businesses on that street. Yeah. So they arrested a whole bunch of people. It was a mess. And I tried to go talk to the chief of police. I mean, it was a bad scene. Yeah. So I learned quickly you have to just be real, real careful. And so when Martin Luther King was assassinated, I was in the hospital at that time. I got very ill. And all you could hear were sirens everywhere. And I was in a ward that was just all African-American old people who were dying. It was the most horrible thing that night. Everybody was just crying and it was on the TV there. It was really horrible. And then we lived right on the edge of another ghetto. So when I went home, it was still, all night there'd be ambulances and police cars driving back and forth. So I learned a lot in Pittsburgh about the civil rights movement. And that was, at that time, I realized, at least what I thought was, we have to change the educational system.
Excuse me.
It's all in education. If we don't change it, it's not going to work. We have to change. I had never wanted to be a teacher. That had never been... I wanted to do research. I wanted to go to the UN, stuff like that. Right. But I realized then that we had to teach, and we had to teach what was really our history. We have to know who we are. And so that was what Pittsburgh did for me.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah.
And then after so then from there you moved to Tucson?
Yeah.
You and Berkeley?
We moved to Tucson. He got a job with the Arizona Theater Company. And I came and I had 3 weeks of utter misery applying for jobs and not getting even an interview for anything. Nobody would talk to me for a job. I'd go home and cry every day thinking, how is it possible that I can't get a job? And so then I had filled in an application at Pima when Barkley did. And so I got a call from them one day and said, the person who was going to fill our history slot for this, they had a grant to start the to start the school. It was very innovative.
Mm-hmm.
Pima was right there at the top with innovative schooling at that moment,
Mm-hmm.
because there were a lot of people in the country that realized with the demonstration of Vietnam, all that we had to do something different with education.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were all kinds of things happening. And so the people who were starting Pima were part of that wave.
Mm-hmm.
So I got a call. Richard Snyder, he said, well, we looked at your CV, and the person who was going to do history here can't fill the slot on this grant that we have. So could you come out for an interview? I said, yeah, I'll be right out there. And so then I explained, well, I don't have a degree in history, but all my work is based on a historical approach, historicism kind of thing. So I had tons of history credits in my transcripts. And besides, I love the history of Mexico, so I'd always taken it, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I sure
do.
do.
So anyway, they called me for an interview. I was interviewed by 25 people.
Oh my gosh.
It was horrible.
Wow.
And so thanks to Lee Scott, who was kind of the point man on that committee, it could have just fallen between the cracks, because I saw that happen with a lot of candidates. It would just fall. We had huge committees. Nobody would really pick up on stuff. He kept it through and he got it on, so I got hired. And I started working there like 3 weeks after they had started this team building process for their first grant. But it was a perfect place for me, because they asked me to do community history. What is the history that our community needs?
Wow.
And
And you were perfect
I was able
for
to
it.
do, well, I don't know, but I found people to help me.
Mm-hmm.
It was just wonderful. And so my first years at Pima were like part of the most exciting academic thing I could ever have done. I just loved every bit of it. I had tremendous support. The president, of course, was all in favor of diversity, and what we now call diversity. It was intercultural, ethnic, whatever.
Yeah.
And then the provost, Rudy Malone, he was out of Berkeley, all into doing education in a totally new way. And then I had what would be a department head. They had other names for them. Louise Bronson. She was a clinical psychologist and really into how people learn and really into civil rights. And they let me do whatever I wanted. It was wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And so with Bill Lewis and me, we would just sit there and put things together in different ways and try this and try that. And see, the students we had then were great, too. Students are always great, but that particular, what was going on in the country made a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is, our first classes started in 1970,
Mm-hmm.
We had Vietnam vets. We had a program to bring in minorities who had never gone to school.
Wow. Yeah.
People who had never had a chance at higher education, regardless of race, whatever, right? And so we had this mixture, older people, young people, veterans, poor kids, and people that were heavily politically involved in the Chicano movement, the African American movement, the American Indian. Everyone was just out seeking to change the world. There was this sense that we could really make a better world. And I guess that's what has me so sad now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Where did it go, And all these great hopes. We would have these intercultural workshops. And I laugh because we had people from the American Indian movement out of North Dakota driving across the country on just a little bit of money to be here with us for a week, right? We had Yaquis that would come up from Sonora. We had Yaquis from here. We had Tojonums. We had African Americans. We had Chicanos. It was wonderful. We'd get together for 4 days and just yell at each other, getting, you're this, you're that, we're this, we're doing that, da, 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 da. Bringing all this history that we could, you know what I mean? It was so exciting. And eating tons of pozole and rice and beans because, you have to feed people. If you're going to have them there 4 days, people would be sleeping bags. And they let me do it. People would get credit. My students would get credit for attending these workshops and Bill's students. And so we had these mix of students from Pima mixing up with all these radicals from all over the country. So
wow, that's really amazing.
It was wonderful.
What an incredible moment.
It was
and
wonderful.
Tucson was pretty,
right?
We had just come off of so-called urban renewal, urban removal, right?
Right.
So I think
but the big thing was the anti-Vietnam movement. It was very strong here. And there were demonstrations here at the U. We had the bear down incidents with the African-American students. The Chicano students were always demonstrating. And we at Pima gave them a place. We hired them to be peer counselors. We had a grant for that, so that they would do stuff here. They would bring students from Pima here. It was a very exciting time.
Wow. So you were looking for ways to support people who were active at that moment.
Exactly. Who were actively involved and wanted to work with youth and would attract youth, but it was also very harsh because. Everybody had their ideas of who was the worst victim or what was, all those things that come when you're trying to do intercultural work.
Right.
And so it was not easy, but Bill and I had gone through training, and we had trained other people. We brought in other people who were trained so that we kind of learned how to run these groups. And a lot of people get real angry. Some of the guys, you can't do that. You waste all your time sitting around talking and you don't go do anything. That whole thing. But they read a lot of stuff. They learned a lot of things. And it was and the big thing was all this anti-Vietnam, and we had all these veterans from Vietnam.
Yeah.
And so here we had this situation. It was really a challenge as a teacher, how to deal with that, and how to bring out all those things. And some veterans were really into being anti-Vietnam, and other veterans were really into supporting it. So it was a real challenge in that way as well.
It's really interesting to me to hear you say this, because at this moment we are so polarized. In this nation, and yet at that moment it seems you found ways to it sounds like it was not easy, but you found ways to dialogue. It seems, right?
Well, I'll tell you, like one time, because I was teaching Western Civ as well. You have to make a living, right?
The day job.
The department has to have students, right? And so I taught Western Civ, and I love teaching, how can I forget now? Rousseau. Love Rousseau, right? My romantic side. And so I had prepared this wonderful lecture on Rousseau. We were starting out the semester, and we had been we were going to do the French Revolution and stuff, and so I was really getting into these ideas. And so I had about 30 students in my class. Our class of Pima were all small, 30 or less. And it was all mostly Anglo students that took Western Civ, because when Pima started, it was mostly Anglo students who were coming to the U. You have a couple of Chicanos, hardly any women, right? Because it was required, the women would study. If they came to the U, they'd go to education or Spanish. And so my classes in Western Civ were mostly white male, but a few minority. So anyway, I walk into class and I start my thing on Rousseau, going great ideas and all this. And I had 3 vets that I knew were vets and sitting in the back of the class, and they started laughing among themselves, and really just. So I told them that they had to stop. Please respect your fellow students, and it said something that was very demeaning. So I said, okay, class is over, don't come back. This was the beginning of the semester. And I did away with the class. I'm sorry. I did get away with a class. And
Reboot.
So then I went back to my head. I thought, my God, what did you just do? I mean, so I went in to talk to Louise Bronson. I just told her what I had done. I said, I don't know what. Well, she said, yeah, I can see how that can happen. They can be pretty lousy. They're so sexist. She was really into the women's movement, too. Mm-hmm. We had it also at Pima. And that was part of the problem, was having women teachers, too.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So she said, just call everybody up and you'll just have to work individually with each one. That's all there is to it. You got to get them through. Oh, I had such a busy semester.
Oh, my gosh.
It was like, 30 students on independent study kind of thing. It was.
Wow.
I paid. I never did that again.
Yeah.
So, yeah, one has to learn the dialogue.
Yeah.
I had to learn how to do that.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
Because, yes, being a woman teacher, we had a lot of Saudi students at certain times. That was really problematic. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But even being a minority woman, it was not easy. Mm-hmm. It was not easy. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so what, I can see your trajectory coming from Munam and coming to the States and being in the swirl of all the civil rights activism in Tucson in the Southwest. How did you get into working on immigration issues?
Oh, well.
Specifically.
Yeah, right. I've always really believed that one works in community, right? Mm-hmm. I went to school to go back to Douglas to change the world. Of course, I never went back to Douglas. But I always saw my education as something that meant you had to give back, right? What you know, people who need what you know, you have to be there for them. And I met Lupe Castillo very shortly after I came because she was doing Chicano history. And a sister of mine who was here at the U of A was in the Chicano movement, and she knew Lupe. Mm-hmm. And she said, the person you have to talk to is Lupe Castillo. She's the historian. So I met with Lupe. It took a while to establish confidence because confidence was not easy among activist students. They had to be careful. Mm-hmm. And then we became very, very close friends. And
you're talking about la confianza, right?
La confianza, yeah. Mm-hmm. Because there was so much distrust. Mm-hmm. And so she, we were able to just really work on Chicano history and set up things for it in a way that responded to what we felt Tucson needed. And she was very active in the Chicano house, and so I kind of was in and out of that. I was not a trusted person in Chicano house, particularly because I was married to an Anglo. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of that stuff. Mm-hmm. And Barkley has been just the most incredible navigator in the world, that he has known how to give of himself with great integrity so that he has built trust in our community no matter what. Mm-hmm. But they didn't know us when we came.
Right.
And so it was, Monzo had been established as part of the War on Poverty community development program that the city had. They would give these grants to these different centers, and so Monzo had been created. And Lupe was on the board there, and so she asked me, she said, we have this group, do you want to come? I said, oh, great. I saw it as a good opportunity to do community work that was not at Pima. And so I started going there, and it quickly was obvious that the service that people needed the most, was helping people with Social Security, all these things that people need, translation of forms, and, all that navigation that has to go on with bureaucracies. We were doing all that. Mm-hmm. But the one that came up the most was the regularization of immigration papers. Okay. And what would happen would be things like this. So here's a U.S. citizen, say it's a man, and he marries a woman from Magdalena. And so, of course, he, at that time, the way the law was, he had a right to bring her in, right? So he would get married, bring her here, and then the thing would be to go to the Border Patrol office in the federal building and put in the papers and make the change. Well, if he did that, she would be deported and told, you have to fix all your papers over there and then come, which would sometimes take 3 or 4 years.
Oh my gosh, right.
And so people didn't go.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing was, if you had a lawyer, you'd go, and they would let you stay here while you did it. So, and people didn't have money for a lawyer, right? So we found out Margot Cowan was hired there as the president. She had been an organizer with Cesar Chavez, a young, energetic person. She got on the ball and got training for our staff there. We had a small staff through the Border Patrol agencies or the immigration agency to train our people to do these things, because you don't have to have a lawyer if you go through this process. So that we then were the people doing the counseling. And so we had all these clients. They'd come to us, we'd fill in the papers, we'd take it to the business, they'd get their papers fixed, and that was that. So that grew enormously very quickly, and that was great. But we had been doing things like police brutality. We got a program approved. There would be big parties and people would be arrested. It was a mess, you know. In the barrio, you know, have these big parties, and then everybody would suddenly get arrested. It was really bad.
They just come in and sweep everybody out.
And so Margot organized all the West Side community, which included Anglos, you know, from further up and right down in the barrio.
You're talking about north, south, like Menlo Park, all the way down
Yeah,
to
the Menlo Park,
Hollywood.
right, but we were especially west, you know, going west, bringing in all the people that were west, which included a lot of Anglos as well. And we had these big meetings and talked about police brutality. Joel Valdez was the city manager at that time, so we had all these meetings with Joel Valdez and ended up signing a contract or an agreement whereby, I don't remember, I think it was like 10 policemen or 6 policemen at a time would be taken out and go through this program that we had. It was 6 weeks. We brought in 2 teachers from Cuernavaca to teach Spanish. They would go through intensive Spanish training and 1 week of cultural training. I think it was 5 weeks of Spanish and 1 week of cultural. It was 6 weeks. And they were paid their full salary for doing this. And so we taught the classes, and we brought in these 2 people who were just wonderful, you know, teaching Spanish as a second language with very new methods. And then Lupe and I did the week of culture, and they would go to people's houses in the barrio, and we would have history lessons for them all morning, and then in the afternoon they go to people's houses. The result of that was the Adam 1 community policing. They put in a police station right down on St. Mary's. And they got to know all the neighborhood. But what happened was, as soon as we trained them, they'd get offers from other cities and they'd leave.
Oh, wow.
So the program lasted about 3 years, but then the city said, well, you know, we're just paying people to go somewhere else.
Right.
But we had done that. So I was really happy, you know, to be involved with this group of women. And we were doing this immigration. Well, one day, it was in April of 76, they raided our office. The police and the Border Patrol came and took everything, even the posters on the wall.
Oh my gosh.
The files of those 500 clients that we had. And that night, they deported several hundred of those people.
Wow.
They accused Margot and the 2 volunteer nuns that worked there with harboring, transporting, whatever, more than 70 years of felony charges. So
they really were going to make an example out of them.
Yeah, and we weren't doing anything illegal. We had permission for everything we did. So they did us a big favor, because what happened was there were all these progressive community here in Tucson. You know, people were in favor of civil rights and all of that.
Yeah.
And we had this great big rally, and all of these people showed up, and we started raising money, and we went on a national level. So Margot Lupe and I, we went all over the country talking to groups, raising money for the defense fund. And then we were lawyers who volunteered. There were all these people in the Democratic Party, and volunteers. We had volunteers all over. So this community was really educated in this process on immigrant rights. We ourselves became more educated about it. You know what I mean? And so we ended up lobbying in Washington. Oh, we did crazy things all over the country. And so we got to know a lot of people. And so finally, when Carter was elected, because this happened under Nixon.
And then Ford probably.
Yeah, and Ford it kept on. But then Carter was elected. When Carter was elected, we'd been doing all this lobbying. We went there to Washington, really hit hard, and then the charges were dropped.
Gosh, okay.
But what we had done in the meantime was we had sued, in the name of those families, we had sued the Immigration Service. And so we found out the Immigration Service, they were so disorganized. They had nothing. They didn't even know who they had deported. They didn't even, they were asking us for the names of the people that they had deported. So we came to an agreement. There were these high level, the senators and, real high level people got together and a settlement was made. And so all those people got papers to come back. And they each got maybe $400 or $500 or something. There was some money involved, but they got papers to come back. But that put us on this road. And see, this happened in 76, right? Well, all the immigration stuff was just building up to a big thing that ended up with the IRCA in 86. So all those years that we were involved in all these issues having to do with immigrant rights. And I just loved doing all that because, well, I had trained. I wasn't a U.S. lawyer and I wasn't doing legal work, but I knew how to help frame things and I knew, you know what I mean, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And so, and then 80s, we have all the Salvadoreños that came up and we were the ones that started working there. Then Sanctuary came out of that. And so I did a lot of work with Margot on asylum cases and testifying in court, all that that stuff. So, yeah, that was like being able to use things I knew was to help.
So you're teaching and you're involved in all this immigration work. Yeah. It sounds like you were very busy and you're raising a family.
Yeah, well, I think my children probably suffered. They grew up going to meetings, I don't think either one of them like meetings at all. They don't go to meetings.
Is one of your sons a teacher?
Well, both of my sons. One was a teacher at Tucson High. He taught literature. Okay. He just retired a couple of years ago. And he rides a bike. He's a racer on bikes even now at this late date. And he writes poetry, and he's getting some published, which is really nice. Wow. Yeah. And my other son is a sociologist, and he teaches at A&M.
Okay. I did see your son speak briefly at what was it? Do you remember of course you do, all of the dust up around Tucson High and the curriculum? Oh, yeah, right, and we had a big meeting there, and he stood up and spoke, and he was so eloquent. Yeah. Chris, right. Well, there's all the flurry of the 1980s and the Immigration Control and Reform Act during the Reagan period, and then... but over this time, it seems like the border is just hardening and hardening and hardening. And
well, a big thing happens because of NAFTA, right? But even before that, when they started negotiating NAFTA, Monzo, which was the one that had led with the asylum cases for the Guatemalans and Salvadoreños, and we've been working with Sanctuary. We were totally burnt out. That kind of work burns people out, and then you have to be raising money as well. Oh my gosh! It's totally a burnout, and so we couldn't keep Monzo open anymore. We didn't have the money, we didn't have the energy, And, the 80s were a difficult time, too, because it was the decade of the Hispanics or something. And there was this Reagan pressure. The politics weren't right for movement. You know what I mean? The movement was kind of frittering out in many ways. And, the politics were just different.
Mm-hmm.
And so we kind of closed down Manzo, and Lupe and a couple of other people, and I helped out a little bit, but not very much. All the cases that were left asylum that were still in court, she organized lawyers to take cases so that we wouldn't leave anyone out there hanging, right? But then we closed down. That was it. So in the late 80s, Lupe and Isabel got together, Isabel Garcia, who had been working with us a lot before, and they started the Messia Organizing Project. But it was for advocacy for immigrant rights, not to do direct services.
Mm-hmm.
The direct services had killed us.
Mm-hmm. This is more like pushing for policy.
Yeah, pushing for policy, educating community,
mm-hmm.
that whole thing. And so they organized, and so I was working with them. We'd have workshops, and we even had, quote, an international conference where we invited Colby, who was a negotiator on the U.S. side for NAFTA.
Jim Colby?
Jim Colby. He was a congressman
mm-hmm.
at that time. And we invited people from Mexico, some people from some unions, and we had a conference over at what was the Ramada Hotel. And so we were discussing all this a lot, the NAFTA thing, trying to put a real strong critique against it. We had a number of forums, and they were very well attended here in Tucson, over on El Rio and El Pueblo. Mm-hmm. So we took that education part really seriously. And Isabel, together with Jesus Roma, were involved in a couple of cases on border mistreatment, and killing, stuff like that. So we kept very much in tune. And an important thing was going on, too. AFSC had appointed Maria Jimenez to organize along the border on both sides of the border. Maria Jimenez is an incredible organizer. She was in Houston, and she started organizing immigrant groups on this side of the border and on the south side of the border. There had already, because of IRCA, we had always been in touch with Chicano organizing on immigration from California. And we had had several meetings, one here, one in San Diego. So there was that going on. And then Maria came in and helped organize more. So there were two things happening. National network that emerged out of the organizing in California with Chicanos and other people on the East Coast. And then this thing that Maria was doing on the border on both sides. So we went down, like we had meetings in McAllen, Texas, and then down south. We would go to Brownsville and Matamoros, meetings. Like every 6 months there would be a meeting on the border. Wow. So we all got to know each other, mm-hmm. Quite well. Because there were a number of issues, enforcement issues that were really problematic. And that was when we did our first study on the Tucson mistreatment, because I had a student from Mexico City who wanted to do some empirical work on immigration, and there was a student out of Madison who was doing the same thing with Texas. So Maria got us together, and we did that Tucson mistreatment study in '94. So all this activity was going on the border on both sides, because we could all see Mexican migration was growing already, right. And we were seeing more and more and more mistreatment on the border. Mm-hmm. And the big thing that happened in California in 1990 with the passing of that 137, whatever that one, mm-hmm. that anti-immigrant law.
I remember that.
And that made it so that the presidential election of '92 with Clinton put closing the border on the national agenda, right? And so the kind of thing that came out of Washington with Clinton was really clamping down. And that's when we began to see in California a growth of deaths. And it was our friends and the organizers in California, Claudia Smith and Roberto Gonzalez. They were the first ones that really pointed to that. And I remember we went to meet with them to talk about the ways that people were dying, and then we were noticing an uptick here. So that by the year 2000, I mean, this was horrible what was going on. And so I retired from Pima in 99, and I had the one class I had developed on the history of the Mexicana Chicana that I had been teaching at the university since 84. Mm-hmm. So I had that one class, so I kept coming to the department. I've been a part of the Mexican American Studies as an adjunct for years doing that class. And so I started talking about immigration a lot, and I did a paper on women's bodies on the border for a conference in Mexico City on cultural studies in the body. And I kind of did a history of experiences of Mexican women in terms of their bodies on the border. And a number of the people there were really interested in it. And so a friend of mine said, well, what are you doing about it? This was in 2003. I said, well, we want to do some research. We want, to have some really good, strong empirical research on what happens on rapes and sexual assault and that, but we don't have any money. We don't have a way of doing it. I don't know what we're going to do. Because we had changed the Mesilla organizing project into Coalición de Derechos Humanos, making that transition from seeing immigration as civil rights to human rights. And that had taken place with the national network and things that appear on the border. We decided that was the way to go. And we had always been thinking we would like to have a research section. We had no money. And, empirical research is really expensive.
Yes.
Takes a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so being at the center, this friend of mine in Mexico City said, well, if you do one study, what do you need? I said, well, I don't know. I could use, a few $1,000 or whatever. So he said, well, I'll give you 10,000. Oh, I said, that's wonderful. So I came over here. I talked to Tony Estrada, who was the head. I said, let's have an institute. I talked to Isabel. I said, we can do what we want, out of derechos. Oh, that's wonderful. Let's get together. Let's set up an agenda, the whole thing. So we did that. And Scott Carvajal, who had a big grant from some big thing he was doing on health, he gave money for me to have someone to help me, which was wonderful. And we started turning out grants.
And this is the birth of the Border Migration Institute in Mexican American Studies. Wow.
And I started sending students out to do things, and so I had 10 students that first summer of 2004. That spring, we had a meeting here. We brought some faculty together. We established the institute and put in paperwork, right? Well, that took years. But anyway, I had students, and I used some of that $10,000 to pay them. And that year, the summer of 2004, I don't know if you were around then, but
I was, yeah.
La Ladrillera, Altar, those places were like crazy with people, right?
I remember,
Everything was going on. It was crazy. So our big question was, what happens to a person who is detained? What is the process? Nobody knew. Nobody had done that. So I had these students all working on, let's find out exactly what happens to people once they get detained. And so then we got I was sending them down, Margot was taking them down, and I was taking them down to La Pedrera, to Altar, to all over, down there, working with some people at the Universidad de Hermosillo.
In the Colegio de Sonora
in the
also,
Colegio
right?
de Sonora
Gloria
also,
Siria. Right.
And I got together with Jill, so we built this quick network. But these 4 students, I got permission for them to do ride-alongs.
Wow.
It was so amazing. These 4 young women, 2 of them practically had a nervous breakdown from that experience. And so I got all those students that had been working together, and we put together a panel that we took to the Chicano Studies Association in Miami, and then the following year in Albuquerque. We had like a pony show, right? One of the young women had written, she was a rapper, and so she wrote a rap song on the deaths on the border.
Oh, wow.
And so what we would do, we'd go to the conference and we'd get our room and we'd set it up and put on that tape, right? So everybody, we didn't get tons of people to come into our session. And then it was boring as anything because, it's so boring to bureaucratic and go through these things. Mm-hmm. But they had some good stories to tell. So we did that, and so we attracted some students that way to come study here because they got really into it. Mm-hmm. I mean, 2004, 2005, big things were happening.
Yeah.
But I had no money to, you can do a certain amount with students, but there was no money. Mm-hmm. So the deaths were just overwhelming. That was like, what can we do? All these community groups had organized, everybody was doing stuff, but there was no empirical work on it. Mm-hmm. So I went to give a talk over at one of the Sunnyside middle schools one day. They had invited me to talk about, women's roles or something. And Richard Elias was there also as a speaker. So Richard was a former student of mine years ago, yeah. So we were walking out talking, how are things going? Okay. I said, well, they're not okay. I said, I need to do something on these deaths and I just can't get any money for it anywhere, no matter how many grants we write. He said, I could come up with $5,000 for you. Oh my God, yes. So we got the letter of agreement from the university and the county, all that kind of stuff together. He sent us the $5,000, and I said, now what am I going to do? So I had two really good students, Daniel Martinez and Inés Duarte. I called them in. I said, okay, here's our chance. And Daniel both of them had worked with me on the summer before, and all that stuff. And so I said, fine. I said, so what are we going to do? We're going to go a really strict path. Nothing we say, nothing we come to, can we not prove. So it's a medical examiner. That's where we have to go. That's where they have the cut and dry information that nobody can debate, right? So derechos have been working with Bruce Parks for a long time already on the death thing. We'd been there before, and he knew us well.
Office of the Pima County Medical Examiner.
Yeah, right. Uh-huh. And so I called and got an appointment. We went and talked to him. He said, sounds fine. So we went over the parameters for how to use the records, etc., that they had. And we wrote a letter of agreement between the U and them. And so we used part of the money to pay gas for for Daniel to go down there and come back. Mm-hmm. I mean, so they went through it. And I said, I wanted to go back to 1980, but we just didn't have enough money for that. So we started 1990. So that we would have a kind of a historical view of these deaths, not just right now, right? And so Daniel has kept that database present. I will be releasing another report later this year on putting them up to date, which is a lot of work because every time they identify someone, it changes the whole thing, right? And of course, these identifications don't happen all at once or anything. So he's been wonderful about keeping that database current and keeping it up. And so we were able to do that.
And Danielle is now a professor of sociology here at the university, right?
Right. And but he does just wonderful work. But he worked with us then,
I know there's so many. I know so many students who, including students whose committees I've been on, who worked with you on these projects, like that moment that you're saying, 2004.
We had all these students that came that used it for their masters. Francisco Valles, Catherine, Kat Rodriguez, And out of Latin American studies, there are over 5 or 6, who use data. Then Glenda, Jenna Glick in international, she was in the Honors College. She's now a professor in the University of Maryland. You know what I mean? We've worked with so many.
Jeremy Slack.
Jeremy, yeah. So we had, a really wonderful group.
What do you see when you look out at what's happening on the border at this moment? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I am so utterly depressed by what I see. I think one of the things that I've learned in coming back here, and thinking back of when I was growing up in Douglas, is that the history of the interethnic relationships is still to be told. And we are so far from telling it. There are a lot of efforts now, but it's still not told. It's not there. And to have a president come in who divides us more and makes it more difficult to tell this story of interethnic relationships makes everything else more difficult, because the border has always been a place of contested identities, of shifting sovereignties. You know what I mean? It's a very dynamic place, and it almost seems to be better off when nobody pays any attention to it. Like when I grew up, nobody cared about the border, except the people who lived there, but nobody else cared. And that was kind of nice in a way. It did lead to these different power differences that were very visible, but communities were often trying to work them out. And I think that after the civil rights movement, it affected the border in the way of also trying to work out better interethnic relationships and ethnic relationships, because newly arrived Mexicans and Mexicans who had been here a long time with the civil rights movement had to kind of also find a way of communicating among themselves. And so to see all that effort that was put in by so many people to try to help us live together in a better way is so threatened now. And I get very sad because I see here in Tucson, we have all these groups, these volunteer groups of Anglo people who want to help Mexican people, you know what I mean, to help migrants, and really do very courageous, wonderful things. And we have people of the Mexican-American community also doing things. But these groups are always being pulled apart by these ethnic identities now. And before, people could make efforts to try to make it work. Now it's harder because of the leadership that we have on top, and the way that this president has approached describing the border, making it a place of crime, the way the laws are put in of criminalizing activity on the border, and now this wall that is like a symbol for the fact that we cannot get along, that we can't, with a total denial of a historical experience that can't be changed. I mean, what's happened is there to stay, and so I get very, very sad at seeing that all that work, I'm sure it's done some good, but it seems like, where do we go from here? And the only thing that encourages me, and it does a lot, is that there are a lot of young people who are really committed to doing something different. I don't know what their vision is for the border, to be very honest. I don't know that we're so busy with each incident, with each moment of crises. Every day there's a different crisis.
A new fire.
There's a new fire. All our energies go into the fires. That to sit down and think of what kind of a life we could have at the border? What vision do we want? Things like a luxury that we don't have time for, because the other things are so immediate and so needy. And so that discourages me. But the fact that there are a lot of young people and people who want to do things. The other thing is, we never talk about the migration to Arizona that comes from the Midwest or from California. And we're dealing with two migrations here, not just one. And nobody talks about that. And I think that's so important. Because the civil rights movement, what it did to Arizona was it made these ethnic communities have to come to some kind of agreement on certain things. And it was far from perfect, right? But there was a conversation, there was a consciousness that was raised around it, and there were certain openings that were made to have a fuller sense of equality, or at least a vision of moving towards equality. And these populations had gone through these things together. They had negotiated. Now we have all these other people coming from other places that have no sense of that struggle, that don't know what that negotiation was, of how it was imperfect, but there was something there. And we never talk about that. And that I find frustrating. I think, and now it's become more difficult because of the atmosphere. So I think the challenge for an interethnic world is harsher, but I think that young people will help it change, and I hope that we are around to help that happen for the young people.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think so. I can feel that in the classes that I do in the classroom. I have students who are asking really astute questions, and I can also feel the how difficult it is for them in this moment, trying to frame it, try to understand it. I mean, as we all are, right? And then just feeling like we're in such a, we're under such siege by our government here in this region. I mean, I shouldn't say we, because it's that threat is born differently by different people, but yeah.
But it affects us all.
It affects us all, for sure.
It affects us all.
No doubt about it. Yeah. No, it feels like a terrible time. At the same time, I was thinking about something that my colleague Emma Perez here at the Southwest Center said when we did an interview with her some weeks ago. She said, when I decided to come to Tucson to take the job at the University of Arizona, a lot of my friends were like, "Why would you go to Arizona? It's such a a hotbed of or such a laboratory of some of the worst racist policies and etc." And she said, "Well, I'm going to Tucson because Arizona also has, on the flip side of that, this incredible history of resistance of all of that and counterculture." And she said that really I feel very drawn to that. I just I thought that was it was really important to hear, because I feel like with so many people that I talk with, we all feel the same, that this is just a terrible, hard, awful moment. It's dismal. But
I think too that Tucson is different from other parts of Arizona.
Yes.
And we have that history, which is very complicated and not easy to unravel, if you like, with the language that we have now. But I think, for example, when I first came to Tucson, when I came back, actually it was before I got married, in 1960, that summer, I was working on my dissertation, and the law library here had all the works of, oh my gosh, how can I forget his name? The great inventor of that theory of sociological jurisprudence. I'll remember in a minute, but anyway, they had all his works here at the library, and so I got permission to use the law library that summer. And I had met my husband in Douglas, but he's from Tucson, so he would come up on weekends. And when we got engaged, a friend of his family had an engagement party. No, she invited us to her house for a party. It was right before we got engaged. It was Bud's Painter. And she lived right downtown in an old, very Tucson house with a patio. And I remember being so excited about this Tucson that I was meeting that was so different to the Tucson I described before of having the fight, because it was there where I met Ed Spicer and Bernie Fontana and Jane Evankovich, people who later became so important when I came back to do this history project. They helped me so much. And I can remember when I met them, I was just fascinated by the fact that they knew so much about Mexico, that they knew so much about the things that I thought were so important for people here to know, and that I had never known people like that before, Anglos who were really enmeshed in that world, right? And I think that Tucson, like other places, Santa Fe, etc., but Tucson has gone in a different direction, maybe, from Santa Fe. I don't know. We have those negative things of using certain historical moments for tourism and not really knowing what's there. You know, it's not a perfect thing, but there was this group of people in Tucson at that time, and that had been here for a while, that were really open to other ways of seeing the world and wanted to bring that out. And I think that exists here in Tucson now also, you know.
Yeah.
But it's hard. It's hard because voices can become very stringent. And so we have to kind of help that happen so we can have this interethnic narrative that has been hard to have in the last couple of years, last few years. But history helps Tucson that way.
Yeah.
Because the resistance is alive, but it hasn't been solely of one ethnicity.
Yeah.
And I think that's important in this story. The Chicano movement was very important, you know, and did tremendous opening wedges that are really clearly only done by Chicanos. However, there have always been those who have found ways of supporting that. And I think of Ray Thompson, for example, who was just an incredible person in trying to help open up that narrative at times when it was very difficult. And not perfect, but really being an important element of that.
And people taking risks and speaking out and supporting. And yeah, I've always appreciated that about Tucson. From the time I got here in 1993, and I grew up in San Diego, in suburbia, so my parents, you know, so the whole thing is pretty conservative, and then I came here, I was like, wow, okay.
What's going on?
Yeah, Tucson is an active place. You know, I could see that right away. Well, Raquel, thank you so much.
Well,
this has been so interesting.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome.
It made me think of things I hadn't thought about for a long time.
Well, I just have such respect for you and the work you do and your integrity, and love talking to you.